go have a listen to the podcast. I run it with Yugopnik and Second Thought, and we have a great time talking about socialism, history, and general nonsense we encounter in our daily lives. I also talk about all the weird patients I see, so go have a listen. Hello. Why is the so-called first world rich? Why are third world countries poor?
You don't go to poor countries to make money. There are very few poor countries in this world. Most countries are rich. The Philippines are rich. Brazil is rich. Mexico is rich. Chile is rich. Only the people are poor. But there's billions to be made there, to be carved out and to be taken. There's been billions for 400 years. The capitalist European and North American powers have carved out and taken the timber, the flax, the hemp, the cocoa, the rum, the tin, the copper, the iron, the rubber, the bauxite, the slaves, and the cheap labor. They have taken out of these countries. These countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited.
Our Italian-American friend over there didn't lie. Let me introduce you to the concept of unequal exchange through a presentation of a fantastic research article that I highly recommend you read. Unequal exchange theory delivers the analysis that the economic growth in so-called advanced economies, think Germany, the US, Japan, etc., what's been referred to as the global north, relies by a large proportion on a significant net appropriation of resources and labor from the global south, think Kenya, Peru, the Philippines, etc. This appropriation reaches astronomical levels. In 2015 alone, the North appropriated 12 billion tons of embodied raw material equivalents, 822 million hectares of embodied land, 21 exajoules of embodied energy, and 188 million person-years of embodied labor, worth $10.8 trillion in northern prices, enough to end extreme poverty 70 times over. Furthermore, global south countries lose far more through unequal exchange than is made up by aid, by a factor of 30. Our analysis confirms that unequal exchange is a significant driver of global inequality, uneven development, and ecological breakdown. Let's get into the history. It should be no surprise that the rise of Western Europe was heavily bolstered by the forcible appropriation and extraction of natural resources and labor from the global south during colonial periods. Spain extracted gold and silver from the Andes, Portugal extracted sugar from Brazil, France extracted fossil fuels, minerals, and agricultural products from West Africa. Belgium extracted rubber from the Congo. British extracted cotton, opium, grain, timber, tea, and countless other commodities from its colonies around the world, all of which entailed the exploitation of southern labor on coercive terms, including through mass enslavement and indenture. Both Europe, as well as the settler colonial societies established in the US, Canada, Australia, etc., directly derived their growth and industrialization of their economies through this form of appropriation, with the younger settler colonial nations reproducing similar imperialist orientations towards the global south. What about the ideology? Let's peel back the curtain a bit. The standard narrative is that after the withdrawal of colonial troops and political administrators, those colonial patterns of extraction ceased. The world economy today is meritocratic. If your nation has strong institutions, solid markets, and works hard, it will become wealthy. Likewise, poor countries are such because they lack the above. Reality is patently different. Rich countries and monopolistic corporations leverage their geopolitical and commercial dominance in the world economy to depress or cheapen the prices of resources and labor in the global south, both at the level of whole national economies as well as within global commodity chains. As a result, for every unit of embodied resources and labor that the South imports from the North, they have to export many more units to pay for it, enabling the North to achieve a net appropriation through trade. Essentially, unequal exchange allows for a hidden transfer of value from the global South to the global North, periphery to core. This takes place invisibly, without the overt coercion of the former colonial apparatus. The fundamental analysis within this paper deals with prices, which convention dictates representing utility, value, the outcome of market mechanisms such as supply and demand, while conveniently glossing over, or obscuring, the role that power imbalances in the global economy play. This is part of modern economic mythology that shifts the blame of underdevelopment onto the victims through maintaining similar patterns of appropriation that once defined colonial economy. Since the advent of neoliberalism, manufacturing has by majority been shifted to the global south. Despite this, the same pattern remains, and northern appropriation from the global south comprises, among other things, number 1, resources and labor embodied in primary commodities, number 2, manufactured goods, even high technology products like smartphones, cars, chips, etc., and 3, intermediate parts. Most of this appropriation occurs through global commodity chains, wherein northern firms deploy monopsony and monopoly power to depress southern suppliers' prices at every node in the chain, from extraction to manufacture, while setting final prices as high as possible. The article in question attempts a quote-unquote footprint analysis of input and output data, basically a way of quantifying the scale of raw materials, land, energy, labor, etc. through the traded goods themselves, as well as all upstream resources and labor that goes into producing and transporting those goods, machines, factories, infrastructure, etc. Essentially, it's a novel way of carrying out the analysis even through complex global commodity chains. Calculating the physical scale of the embodied resources that flow between the global north and the global south needs definitions, unsurprisingly. Global North is defined according to the IMF's Advanced Economies grouping, so USA, Canada, Western and Northern Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, amongst others. While all other countries, the IMF's Emerging and Developing Economies categorization, are classified as the Global South. Secondly, they measure direct and indirect trade flows between the two through tracking 4 categories: materials measured in raw material equivalents, land, energy, and labor. Through this analysis, we see that for every unit of embodied raw material equivalent that the South imports from the North, they have to export on average 5 units to pay for it, a ratio of 5 to 1. For land, the average ratio is also 5 to 1. For energy, it's 3 to 1, and for labor, it is 13 to 1. This pattern results in significant net flows of resources from the South to the North. So, in 2015 alone, the North's net appropriation from the South totaled, as mentioned before, 12 billion tons of raw materials, 822 million hectares of land, 21 exajoules of energy equivalent to 3.4 billion barrels of oil, and 188 million person-year equivalents of labor, equivalent to 392 billion hours of work. By net appropriation, these researchers mean that these resources are not compensated in equivalent terms through trade. They are effectively transferred for free, and this appropriation is not insignificant in scale. It's exactly the opposite. It comprises a very large share, on average about a quarter of the North's total consumption. The political, social, economic, and ecological consequences of this net appropriation are ridiculous. All these land, energy, raw material, and labor resources could be used for the needs of those economies in their own development, but instead is mobilized around servicing consumption in the global north. To put it in comprehensible terms, 21 exajoules of energy would be enough to cover the annual energy requirements of building out necessary infrastructure to ensure that all 6.5 billion people in the global south have access to decent housing, public transport, healthcare, education, sanitation, communication, etc., etc. 822 million hectares of land, which is twice the size of India roughly, would in theory be enough to provide nutritious food for up to 6 billion people, depending on land productivity and diet composition. That's also not mentioning the significant ecological consequences. Offset manufacturing and material use in overexploited nations accounts for more than 90% of biodiversity loss and water stress. Soil depletion, water depletion, chemical runoff, health impacts of particulate pollution, social impacts of exploitation, as in regional conflict, loss of non-renewable resources with no offset by investment in capital stock, etc., etc., etc. All of these environmental and other consequences of the North's consumption are shifted onto the South, effectively offshoring them. Excess resource consumption in the global North is a major driver of ecological breakdown, consuming 4 times over the sustainable threshold, and of which 58% is sustained by net appropriation from the global South.